I am a lawyer, but I am not necessarily your lawyer. The materials discussed in this podcast are for informational purposes only and should not be deemed legal advice. If you have a specific legal question according to your circumstances, then I encourage you to speak with an attorney licensed in your jurisdiction. Welcome back to another edition of Ag Law Today. I'm very excited to have Professor Richardson back. And today we're talking about all things right to farm. Professor Jesse Richardson, why don't you introduce yourself again, update us on where you are and what you've been up to.
Hey, I'm Jesse Richardson. I'm a professor at West Virginia University College of Law, and I'm an Ag Econ major from Virginia Tech. I grew up in Virginia, president of the FFA chapter, and was president of the American Agricultural Law Association. Practiced law in my hometown of Winchester for a while. Then I taught at Virginia Tech, and now I'm at WVU, and I'm loving it.
Excellent. So let's talk a little bit about the right to farm law. I get a lot of questions about this. In broad strokes, tell us what exactly is the right to farm?
So basically, and this differs from state to state, but in essence, right to farm is a state law. All 50 states have it that says if the farm was there first and then suburbanites encroach upon the farm, basically, if the farm follows generally accepted agricultural practices, it is not a nuisance. So the neighbor can file a nuisance action, but the farmer can defend that by saying, I have the right to farm. And it all started with a Arizona case back in 1972, where a developer leapfrog from Phoenix way out into the country beside a cattle feedlot. And the developer put in all of these houses. And then for some odd reason later, he's like, oh gosh, I can't sell my houses because the cattle feedlot smells bad. And so he sued the farmer, and the court found in favor of the developer and made the farmer move. In response to that, each of the 50 states has passed a law that seeks to protect farms in that situation.
So I've gotten a lot of very interesting questions over the years from my position. When I was practicing primarily in New York City, I would get some questions about how this applies to urban agriculture. Any thoughts there?
Oh, wow, that is a tough one, and that's something I've thought about too, because right to farm was started in this suburban context where the development goes out to the rural areas and encroaches upon the farms. So it really, frankly, in my opinion, does not fit the urban context. And there are a lot of problems because in a lot of states, if the farm is established, then the local government can't zone it out or anything of that nature. So I know in Detroit, for example, they're really afraid to allow agriculture in the city of Detroit because they're afraid that if the agriculture goes there in some of the many vacant lots that they have now, later when they want to redevelop the area and have more industry come in, that right to farm will prevent them from doing that. So I'm not aware that they have made any changes, and I don't know what happened in New York City, but it's a real concern in the urban areas. And I think in some instances is a hindrance to urban agriculture.
So in New York, you have to be a farmer in an agriculture district, which is different than a zoning district. And so in New York City was excluded from all the agriculture districts that were identified in the statute. So that's how New York has dealt with it. But from state to state, obviously, things differ there. So when you talked about how the right to farm applies to farmers that are doing what's called, is it generally acceptable agriculture activities? Yes. Yeah. What is considered an agriculture practice under the general rule?
Yeah, generally they're going to look at what is normally done in that community. What does a farmer do? In New York, what do most New York dairy farmers do? And that's going to be generally accepted practice. They're also going to look at, have you violated any laws? Have you violated any permits? And obviously, if you've done that, that gets the right to farm protection is removed for you. You have to be doing things the right way.
Who's the person or the entity that's evaluating whether the farmer is conducting proper practices?
Sometimes the state statute, so the state legislature will lay that out in a law. But for the most part, it's going to be the courts that are going to look at it and see if there's anything that the court feels is out of line, or maybe the jury.
So what's the applicability to the right to farm for agritourism operations, which, you can see the whole gamut, anything from corn mazes to people having concerts, at their farm to, pick your own, which, in the month of October, could be really, really busy, causing traffic problems. So have you seen any litigation around that?
Yeah, I have, and it depends. Each state is going to have a different definition for agriculture. What is agriculture? And that's something that I personally have been looking at for years now, because the cases are just all over the place on what is agriculture. And is agritourism agriculture? It depends on how the state defines that. And then when you get to agritourism, what is agritourism? I remember a crazy case out of Florida where skydiving onto a farm was agritourism. In Delaware, paintball is agritourism. So it really is going to depend on the particular state definition.
So talk to me about North Carolina. I think that there's been a lot of litigation in North Carolina. What's going on there?
Yeah, in the past year or so, there have been a lot of things going on in North Carolina. There were 26 lawsuits filed by neighbors of some hog farms. And the neighbors basically said that these hog farms are unreasonably interfering with our enjoyment of our property, which is a nuisance. And they filed the lawsuit, asked for huge amounts of damages. And the first thing the hog farms did was say, right to farm, we're protected. But the North Carolina court looked at it and said, going back to that Arizona case, in North Carolina, the law says if somebody moves out to the farm and that becomes a problem, then right to farm protects you. In these cases, the court said people have been living right outside the farm for years and years. So yeah, more people have moved in, but nothing has really changed in that respect. So right to farm doesn't apply. And that's even though these hog farmers complied with all their permits, complied with all generally accepted agricultural practices, and did nothing illegal. So that really sent shockwaves through the agriculture community when the first jury verdict came in, and it was for $50 million and included some punitive damages. So it really shook up a lot of people.
So what has been the general reaction in those in the agriculture community in North Carolina? Has there been any proposed changes to the law as a result of this court case.
Yeah, North Carolina actually amended their law. And so now, if the same lawsuits were to happen now, the hog farms would win because they now say if the hog farms have been operating and they are operating legally and doing everything they're supposed to do, and nothing in the hog farm changes, then right to farm applies. They say no punitive damages. They limit the damages that somebody filing suit can get. Um, they just really strengthen right to farm and limited the right of neighbors to file these lawsuits. And not only in North Carolina, it is spreading all over the place. West Virginia just passed amendments to our right to farm law that look exactly like North Carolina. So they saw what North Carolina did. The Farm Bureau here in West Virginia was really shocked by what happened. So we've changed our law now too as well.
Do you anticipate any pushback or legal issues as a result of these amendments?
Yes, I do. I mean, the question is, has this gone too far? And back in the 1990s, there were a couple cases, one in Iowa and one in Washington State, where farmers were sued under the Right to Farm Act, and they raised that defense. And the neighbors said, wait a minute, that's unconstitutional. The Right to Farm Act takes my property rights by forcing me to allow your dust, noise, and odors on my property. And the Iowa and Washington State courts both said, you're right, neighbors. This is unconstitutional. So, in my opinion, uh, these amendments in North Carolina and West Virginia and other states, it's likely to prompt some backlash, and we might see some litigation saying these go too far and they violate the neighbor's property rights. So I think it's going to be an interesting dynamic.
Well, there's definitely been a lot of litigation, across the United States on the right to farm. I mean, do you have any recommendations, for the agriculture community when it comes to the right to farm, just generally speaking?
Well, I would say that the best policy is that farmers should get to know their neighbors, maybe even go across the fence and sit down and talk to their neighbors. Before you expand your operation, maybe go talk to your neighbors, explain what you're going to do, get their buy-in to it. If you can solve the problems over the kitchen table, that's always a better way to do it. Now, that means that lawyers like you and me aren't going to make as much money, but I think that's a good thing in this case. And I think you had said in an earlier podcast that lawyers need to try to prevent these lawsuits from happening. And I think that's how we can prevent it from happening, is having that ongoing dialogue with your neighbors. And if you're going to pass these kind of laws, it reminds me of a law that was passed in South Carolina that gave farmers some preferential rights as to water. Different than right to farm, but basically the Farm Bureau and the farmers in South Carolina did this under the table, behind closed doors, not a lot of public input. And when the public found out about it, they were outraged, and there was a lot of backlash. So I think get the public involved, be a good neighbor, and try to work things out without going to court.
Yeah, absolutely. One note that I just wanted to mention just very briefly that Illinois, New York, New Jersey, and I think in over 40 states, there's an agriculture mediation program that will mediate for free any right to farm dispute. So that's something to also keep in mind if you're an agriculture producer having an issue with a neighbor. Well, Professor Richardson, I was wondering if you had any advice for our listeners who are looking for an agriculture attorney to have that ongoing, continuing relationship. What's your advice on finding the right partner there?
Yeah, I get that question all the time, and it's a hard one, but I think the best thing to do is to talk to your neighbors, talk to your extension agent, maybe your banker, your accountant, people in the community, and see if they've had good or bad experiences with lawyers in the area. I think it's always better to get a lawyer that's pretty close to you, that's in the community. And I think go ahead and build that relationship before the problem happens so that if anything happens, you can call that attorney and they can be on it right away and take care of you instead of having to try to call different attorneys and scrambling to get things done after a problem happens.
I think that's great advice. So how can people find you? Are you online? Do you have social media?
I'm on Twitter. I think my handle is Jesse J8785. And I don't have a blog. I need to be like you and do that kind of thing. But go to law.wvu.edu and you can find my email address and my phone number. I'd be happy to hear from you.
Well, thanks so much for your time and your expertise. I appreciate it.
Thanks.